Welcome to this MOOC on media laws and ethics. Today, we are going to discuss theoretical frameworks related to ethics. In fact, there are theoretical frameworks proposed by psychologists and philosophers to understand ethics. Of all of them, there are two approaches which are prominent. One of them is utilitarianism and the other one is deontological ethics. Let's look at them now. Utilitarianism is a branch of philosophy or an ethical philosophical principle from consequentialism. According to consequentialism, any action that we take or any decision that we take should be determined based on the consequences that such an action would have for people involved, for stakeholders involved in this action. Utilitarianism was first proposed by Jeremy Bentham. Bentham says, it is the greatest good to the greatest number of people, which is the measure of right and wrong. So, if a particular action that we do brings benefits to a larger number of people, then that particular action is considered to be right. Utilitarianism is of the view that any moral action that produces the most good is the right action. It is not only the action, but also the rule by which the action is justified. So, here John Stuart Mill actually proposes a principle called the greatest happiness principle. Mill emphasizes on the social happiness than individual happiness. He says that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So, if a particular action promotes sadness, then it is not a right action. It should promote happiness is what he means when he says this, because he says the reverse of happiness gives pain to people or it harms others. So, he says the moral rules which forbid mankind to hurt one another, in which we must never forget to include wrongful interference with each other's freedom, are more vital to human well-being than any maxims, however important they may be. So, you must have come across many misleading advertisements, and a very common example that you might have come across is this fairness advertisement, fairness cream advertisement, which sells the product saying that pimple free and fair looking faces will get jobs easily, and this is an ad which is meant for females. Or you must have come across some of these commercials and advertisements wherein certain beverages are capable of boosting performance in sports and schools, that is in academics. These ads are harmful. While showing women might maximize the profit for the brands per se, but such depictions on the other hand actually harm them. So, these ads should be questioned. Laura Soderlin says that utilitarianism is often summarized as the outcome that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. So, if there is a small minority which is getting affected, but on the other hand if you have a majority of people who are getting benefited, then the action which is in favor of the majority is considered to be good. But this is something that Laura Soderlin questions, which is like approving of the torture practices by policemen, or approving of torture practices by certain agencies such as CIA torturing detainees at Guantanamo Bay. And capital punishment is also subjected to same kind of criticism. So, another criticism against, or the chief criticism against utilitarianism is that decisions are usually made by people in power and not by those who will be impacted by these decisions. And in this context, then what we arrive at is the fact that morals are not absolute. Now, let us look at a few more examples. I am going to present you with what is known as a trolley problem in psychology. In this, there is a trolley car which is moving on a certain track, and at some point the track is forking out or branching out into two. On one side of the track there are 5 people who are working, and on the other side of the track, on the other track, there is one person who is lying down. Now, as a driver, which path would you take? Now, if you are going to apply the greatest good or the greatest happiness principle that has been prescribed by utilitarianism, then you would rather want to choose the path where one person is lying, because it's all right to kill one person as opposed to 5 people who are working. But this is an example which has been given by several people, but if you are going to change the scenario into something like, what if the one person on the path happens to be an infant? So, would you save an infant, or would you save 5 people who are aged around 60 or 60 plus? Similarly, you look at the raft in the other picture. Now, there is a shipwreck, and you are one of the team members who has gone to this particular location where the shipwreck takes place, and you are trying to rescue survivors. Now, there are 2 rafts, but unfortunately, you have enough fuel to support only 1 raft. The first raft has about 5 people, and the second raft has about 3 people. So, you can save only one of the rafts, which means people sitting in one of the rafts. So, which one would you save? So, again you probably would choose the first raft because it has about 5 people. Similarly, you look at social media monitoring done by government. Now, on the one hand, you might say that the government is indulging in surveillance and there is no privacy when it is actually looking at each of us and each of our profiles. But on the other hand, it might say that it is doing it for the greater good of reducing harm and also for reasons germane to security. Another example that I would like to give is that of Watergate scandal and Watergate investigative reporting that was done by 2 journalists, and one of the journalists was Bob Woodward. In fact, this investigative story led to the resignation of President Nixon in the US. But what is quite interesting is that Bob Woodward himself says that this story wouldn't have been possible without not disclosing the name of the source, without identifying the source. So, which means he did not identify the source for the greater good of letting the people know about this scandal. So, these are some of the examples which you can think about, and probably you can even contemplate as to how you can apply the utilitarianism principle in order to arrive at an ethical action. Now, let us look at another very popular and famous framework related to understanding ethics and morality. This was proposed by Immanuel Kant, a very popular and a famous philosopher. Utilitarianism, according to Mill, focuses more on the outcome and consequences. Consequences are future events. For instance, if there is a lot of violence in films, analyzing its consequences is one thing. But in the first place, should one include violence and vulgarity in films? In this context, we must turn to Immanuel Kant's deontological ethics. This term deon in deontological ethics means duty. So, Kant focused more on actions or duty than other consequences. Morality, according to Kant, is concerned with doing actions that fulfills one's moral duty, disinterested in personal gain of any kind. So, we are not talking about what one is going to gain. We are not talking about consequences. Is this action ethical or not? Look at this image. There is a beggar, and on the same road there is a person who is walking by him. So, this person walking by the beggar might stop by and give away some alms or money to the beggar, or sometimes he would decide against it. Now, how is this different from utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is built on what is known as consequences. For example, if there are 4 patients in a hospital, and if there is one patient who is in good condition, and if these 4 patients are in need of organs, can we kill this person to take out all the organs and help these 4 patients? This is a fictitious example that I am giving. So, it always explains the greatest good that a particular action would lead to. But on the other hand, here what I am talking about is deontological ethics, where do you think it is the duty or is an ethical duty of a person to help a beggar? Now, when this person, if the person is going to think that yes, I should do it, then he is probably thinking about a certain rational decision that he wants to take. On the other hand, if the person is going to help the beggar because he sympathizes with him, because he pities him, then what if he does not pity but rather gets angry with him? So, if the person is angry, then he will not help the beggar. If the person pities the beggar, then he will help. Here emotions are playing an important role, but what Kant says is that any ethical decision that you take should be outside of emotions, should be outside of religion, it should go beyond, it should transcend religion, it should transcend superstition. So, there is no place for emotions. So, if you decide to give or help a beggar, it should be based on the ethical duty. You should think that it is your duty, not because you either pity him or you do not pity him at all. So, moral duties are understood by reason. That is what Kant says, which he also explains in a concept called the categorical imperative. Not because it satisfies you. So, it is not because okay, I have helped a person and I am not for your self satisfaction. So, this is something which is very important. And the second question that you must be asking yourself is, what if everybody acted in the same way? So, how do you take a decision? So, for example, if you decide to help a beggar, then the first question that you are thinking about is, do we think that others would also do the same? If that is the case, then the kind of action that you are indulging in has the possibility of becoming a universal rule, which is what he is explaining through categorical imperative. So, he also explains it as a universalist principle. So, we need to be self-conscious, we should be aware of the reasons behind our actions, we should know why we do what we do. It is one of the highest principles of Kant's theoretical philosophy, and this is what Rolf says. At the same time, he says, Kant said that the normative theory of ethics, what we ought to do, cannot be determined based on our experiences in terms of the effects of our actions or the causes of the action. So, here I would like to give an example. For instance, take the case like you are waiting at the traffic signal, and the ethical duty is to wait for the signal to turn green, only then you should go. But if you are jumping the signal, if you are cutting corner because you have an important duty to attend to, then you should ask this question: would everybody do the same? Would everybody jump the signal? Would everybody cut a corner? Would everybody sneak through the signal? If that is not the case, then it cannot become a universal rule. So, jumping the signal cannot become a universal rule. So, that is what he is trying to explain using this deontological approach. Kant's deontology is also premised on human autonomy. Human beings should be free to determine their own course of action, but these actions should be governed by reason. So, something which he repeatedly says, that reason is very important to validate our action. Thus, human beings have the freedom to choose their actions and apply them, but there is a condition to it. What we think is the right action should also be the right action for others. Kant, while talking about categorical imperative, says that duties performed should not be different for different people and societies. So, you must remember that while talking about morality, we said that moralities can change from society to society, from culture to culture, but here it should be the same for all people because it is built on rationality. So, you can talk about, for instance, paying debt. So, if you have taken loans, then you have to repay. So, that is an ethical duty of every person who is borrowing loans from banks. But on the other hand, we also learn that there are a lot of farmers who are committing suicides because they are not able to repay their loans. So, here what we need to understand is whether banks are using farmers as a means to achieve certain ends. So, sometimes you must have seen certain commercials wherein children are being used as a means to accomplish the task or goal of maximizing profit for brands. So, Kant categorically states that you cannot use people as a means to achieve something. Today, social media and other platforms are filled with fake news, and how are we going to counter this? So this is where I think Kant's deontological ethics would be useful. So what is our ethical duty? What is the ethical duty of a journalist? Which is not to spread misinformation and disinformation. So there's ethical code of conduct that different organizations have prescribed. India also has PCI, Press Council of India, which has prescribed ethical code of conduct for journalists. Now, there are a lot of examples that one can give as far as this is concerned. Is it all right to conduct sting operations by masking the identity of a journalist in the first place? There are some news organizations, especially digital news organizations in India, who has very clearly specified that such acts are not permitted. So you cannot mask yourself, you cannot masquerade your identity as somebody else, as a doctor or as a policeman, to gather or obtain information. You have to disclose the identity of your being a journalist to get information. Another example that I would like to give is that of not disclosing the identity of a source, which is very, very important. Similarly, here Judith Miller, a journalist with the New York Times, she chose to go to the jail than reveal the identity of a source. So sometimes a source would give you information, but on the grounds that anonymity will be maintained. So even if sometimes the court asks for this information, certain journalists will not give this information about the source. So she is one. Judith Miller is one of the journalists who had to go to the jail. She did not break the promise. So breaking promise is also a Kantian deontological ethical rule. So she worked on an article on Joseph Wilson, who was sent to Niger, Iraq on a fact-finding mission. So far, we have discussed what is utilitarianism and deontological ethics. Utilitarianism, or the principle of utilitarianism, is founded on the idea of evaluating an action on the basis of consequences that such an action would have. For example, let's try to understand the ballad of Robin Hood. Robin Hood would steal money from the rich and give it to the poor. This is deontologically not correct. But on the other hand, if you're going to apply the principle of utilitarianism, then probably you might gauge, or you might say that this is okay because this is helping a lot of poor people. But on the other hand, when it comes to legal aspect, this is liable for punishment. Similarly, I must also give you an example of the Spanish Civil War. During this time, a photographer took a photograph of a soldier falling. This is one of a very popular photograph which is titled as The Falling Soldier. But in later years, it was found that the photographer in fact allegedly staged the entire action. So is this ethically right? From a deontological perspective, is it all right to stage photographs, to take photographs by staging it?